Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have bad, good, and crazy martinis for conservatives as we wrap up the work week. Our first two deal with the horrific shooting at the Capital Gazette newspaper offices in Annapolis, Maryland, that left 5 people dead, others injured. The shooter is in custody. A couple different ways to start this as the bad martini, Jim. Obviously, the fact that all this carnage happened and that all these families are devastated as a result of this unhinged person's horrific actions is bad enough of itself. But once again, as we see so many times in these shootings, the warning signs were there. Looking at a couple different stories here to piece this all together. The Baltimore Sun reports that a Twitter page in the shooter's name on Thursday featured the columnist there that he had a beef with from back in 2011 as his avatar and a banner image that included 2 other people from the paper. This all stems back to a feud that the shooter had with the Capital Gazette from a 2011 article that they did covering the fact that he was on trial for criminal harassment and convicted for it because he was trying to start a relationship with a former high school classmate via Facebook. She was tracked down by a reporter and said that she warned former police officials years ago that, quote, he will be your next mass shooter. One of the people that was on his Twitter banner was interviewed. He's no longer with the paper. He's retired to Florida. He said that this is a guy named Thomas Marquardt. He says, I was seriously concerned he would threaten us with physical violence. I even told my wife we have to be concerned this guy could really hurt us. Marquardt said he called the Anne Arundel County Police about the shooter in 2013, but nothing came of it. He consulted the paper's lawyers about filing a restraining order, but decided against it, saying, I remember telling our attorneys this is a guy who is going to come in and shoot us. You point out in the Jolt today, Jim, that even after the harassment conviction, he was still able to get a gun in a very anti-gun state of Maryland. And then very quickly here, even before we had any idea what the motive was behind this shooting, once again, the unhinged left here on Twitter, Lauren Duca, who's no stranger to crazy tweets, again, Daily Caller compiling these, she says, the shooting today in the Capital Gazette newsroom in Annapolis, Maryland, cannot reasonably be separated from the president's mission to villainize the press as the enemy of the American people. Another reporter, Tom Martin from KCTV5, blasphemous, endless, hateful rhetoric straight from the top, and now here we are. David Jolly, former Republican congressman from Florida, but he's so anti-Trump now, I think he's the running mate for the likely Democratic gubernatorial nominee in Florida. He says, while we wait for more news from Maryland, perhaps this is the moment when Trump and the GOP, including sitting U.S. senators, may consider stopping their attacks on the press. Now, right now. He says, I stand by the message regardless of motive, and I predict if it is workplace shooting, the GOP will use that as a pass to continue their attacks. Whatever the motives of the shooter, which we don't know, the fact we now have to consider it is damning enough. So, Jim, what do you make of it?
Yeah, a lot to download there. The first thing that comes to mind is there's no doubt, Maryland is comparably a state where it is fairly difficult to purchase a firearm. You cannot purchase a firearm if you've been convicted of a felony, and you cannot purchase a firearm if you have any violent crime at all. And if you've been convicted of a crime that is a misdemeanor but carries a sentence of 2 years or more. When he had his incident with the high school classmate that he was, sounds like just haranguing and being an absolute menace to online, there were 2 charges that could be applied to this sort of criminal behavior. One is harassment. The other one is stalking. Stalking is the more serious charge, carries a 2-year sentence. The prosecutor, he pled guilty to it, presumably a plea bargain. If you plead guilty to harassment, we won't pursue you on the stalking charges, which are more serious. Harassment carries a potential jail term of up to 90 days. He got probation. He basically was told, keep your nose clean, and this will pass. Because of that, he was able to legally purchase a gun. We don't know all the details on how he obtained the firearm that he used in the shooting spree, but at this point, there's no reason to think that he had gotten it in an illegal manner, stolen it, or anything like that. As of yesterday afternoon, until he went in there and started shooting, this is a man who was legally able to purchase a gun in Maryland. Now, some people would say, doesn't this show that the gun control laws are too loose? I think actually the lesson of this is that if plea bargaining, which my friend Cam Edwards just informed me that 90% of criminal cases end with a plea bargain, which strikes me as a stunning, stunningly high total. Look, there are reasons prosecutors do this. They have to make judgment calls all the time. A plea bargain generally saves time, saves money. You never know what a jury is going to do. We all remember OJ. We all remember cases in which we thought somebody was guilty as sin, but the jury looked at the evidence differently, heard things differently, and chose not to convict. Most of the time, prosecutors can walk away from a process of a plea bargain and say, justice was served, at least on some level. In this case, the decision to pursue the lesser charge left him free to purchase a firearm. And what happened Thursday happened. And that's, you got to think we may have time to reevaluate. My first question is, well, what's the point of all those gun control laws if a guy like this can get his hand on his gun? Also, I find it really fascinating that harassment is not considered a violent crime. I suppose if you're being the victim of being harassed, it certainly feels violent or threatening or menacing to you. And the second thought is the sense that the descriptions from everyone else, publisher of the paper said he talked to the cops and nothing really came of it. He had contemplated filing a restraining order but chose not to follow up on it. Most of the people who encountered him said this guy seemed like a nut job and a guy who was a ticking time bomb and all that kind of stuff. There's been a little bit of self-aggrandizement amongst journalists since this shooting news broke yesterday, but I do think it's worth noting that just about every newspaper in every community has at least one crank. I remember working on our college paper, and there was some woman who lived in the neighborhood who just wrote us along the lines of, my dog is talking to me and there are space aliens living among us and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes it's kind of an amusing crank, and sometimes it's a very, very troubling and disturbing and frightening crank. And this is not a really rare set of circumstances in the world of journalism. Does this mean that we should spend a lot of time patting ourselves on our backs? I don't know about that, but just a recognition that to do this job in the 2018 America involves a certain level of risk. Most days a very manageable level, but it's worth keeping that in mind. As you mentioned, look, as soon as a shooting, a massacre, a bombing, a terror, something like this happens, people start to wonder who did it and why. Greg, I remember in the initial days after the Boston Marathon bombing back in 2013, there was a lot of talk. This was in that third week in April when it's the anniversary of Waco, the anniversary of Oklahoma City, Patriots Day, a whole bunch of, it's just right after tax day. And there were a lot of people who said, this is the right time of year. It might be militia attack. And I remember sitting there thinking, Greg, why would a militia attack the Boston Marathon? It just didn't really make much sense as a target. If you are angry at the government, if you're angry at overarching state, you can kind of understand that. The Boston Marathon, it just seemed like this really random choice. It turned out to be quasi-jihadists, the two Chechen immigrants who were full of rage and all that kind of stuff. In the case of this one, it's attack on a newspaper office. So on the one hand, you could say, this person has a grudge against journalism, national news media, et cetera, but it's the Annapolis Gazette. Offices of the Washington Post are not far away. About an hour away from Washington, from Annapolis. Every D.C. bureau of every news organization in the world can be found in Washington, D.C. So there was this question of why would you, if you're, stop picking on Trump media, why would you attack the Annapolis Gazette? Now we find out that it very much related to a objection to a column about this person facing the stalking accusations back in 2011, and it just grew out of that. And this guy was apparently an obsessive grievance collector. And that is what led to this. So all very dark, very depressing. I don't think it does us. On the one hand, I'm not going to give too much grief to anybody, but for speculating, because that's what we do when we see shocking news or something like that. And I do think some of this stems from the question of, is Twitter the office water cooler where people are just kind of chatting, or is it journalism? Is it something you're putting your name next to and putting it forth as offering? Are you rumor mongering? Are you jumping to conclusions? Some of these things that are done in casual conversation aren't such a big deal. Once you put it on Twitter, it's out there for the whole wide world to say. If you asserted that this shooting was because of Trump or something like that, you probably should retract that and apologize. I think it's pretty clear that that's not the case. Now, separately, it's not good to see the President of the United States running around saying things like the media is the enemy of the American people. You and I have ripped into the media for all kinds of bad journalism and bias and mistakes and all kinds of things like that. I think enemy of the American people is putting it a little stronger than it needs to be. When I think of enemies of the American people, Greg, I'm thinking ISIS, I'm thinking Al-Qaeda, Iranian mullahs, hostile foreign intelligence organizations, things like that. So the whole thing kind of leaves you rather dispirited that something like this happened again, that it seemed so preventable, and that the reaction was so predictable and I think really not focused on the actual facts of what happened.
Well said. Let's move on to the positive aspects of this in a fairly brief good martini here, Jim, also with two different prongs to it. First of all, the response of the police. While they might not have done all they could have in responding to concerns about this shooter over the past few years, their response to this was within 60 seconds, which obviously suggests that they were very close by when the first word of this came to them. But within 60 seconds, they were there. They were still putting on their gear, according to some reports. They were going in. They were not going to stand down like we saw in Parkland and so forth. And they were ready to engage. They were going to do everything they could. And the fact that they did is the reason we still have people from that paper who can tell us what happened that day and thankfully still have their lives. The commitment of them to continue to put out the paper when the office is a crime scene and they're obviously emotionally shattered, and to get it done speaks to their professionalism and their commitment. And obviously the cops, once they got the call, did a great job too.
Yeah, completely concur on both of those points. I trying to imagine what could be more difficult. You've either ducked under your desk or had to flee or dealt with someone who quite literally was there perfectly willing to kill you, to put all your emotions aside, gather the facts, and put out a paper the next day. It's astonishing, the sort of thing they will tell stories about, a generation from now, about dedication to the job and the importance of informing the public. And as you mentioned, the police, look, the location of this wasn't really in what we think of as downtown or Annapolis by the harbor. It's by a couple of major roads, probably the sort of thing that are heavily trafficked and likely to have police presence not too far away. 60 seconds is fantastic. And it also kind of observes that, as you mentioned, that there was nothing resembling Parkland, no delay, no hesitation. They understood the level of the threat and reacted accordingly. And in light of everything, Greg, also somewhat impressive, they were able to take him in alive.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So well done to the surviving staff and certainly the law enforcement officers involved in that horrific situation. So, Jim, we need to lighten the mood a little bit here as we head into the weekend. So we head into our crazy martini, and it's not often you get a double-barreled crazy martini out of the very same interview. But New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand is doing her very best to accomplish that, and today she has succeeded. She was on with Chris Cuomo in his new primetime program on CNN Thursday night, and she talked about a number of issues, two of which were the Supreme Court vacancy and the upcoming Trump nomination to replace Anthony Kennedy. And he also asked Gillibrand about the brand new socialist nominee in New York's 14th congressional district who knocked off Joe Crowley, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So let's take a listen to each of these. First of all, Cuomo and Gillibrand talking about Trump putting together a new nominee.
So to think that you're going to have a normal process under this president who hasn't done anything normally at all, I think is not. It's not a smart bet, because the truth is he's not going to do it. He's going to pick an ultra-conservative. And nobody believed him. No one believed him.
Still got the votes.
He didn't get a vote from one Democrat.
The look on Chris Cuomo's face after that is classic. If you see the video, go ahead and take the time to see that. But after she finished the rest of her answer, he came back to that point.
Are you right that he didn't get one vote? Didn't he get three? Didn't he get Manchin?
He got no Democratic votes.
He didn't get Manchin, Heitkamp?
He did not. They stood strong, and they passed it with Republican votes.
Oh, I thought he got three, by the way.
You might be right, Chris, but I believe this Democratic caucus will stand together.
My talking point just fell apart into 1,000 pieces, but don't worry about it this time. And then he asked Gillibrand about Ocasio-Cortez, talking about her desire to abolish immigrations and custom enforcement. Cuomo, I think, was expecting Gillibrand to be a little more moderate on this issue. It's not what he got.
She's also got some positions that are even to the left of Bernie Sanders. She wants to get rid of ICE. Now, what are you going to do with your party if you do come into a majority and you have a significant number, or at least an influence, of people who have that kind of a position?
Yeah. Well, I agree with it. I don't think ICE today is working as intended.
Well, you think you should get rid of the agency?
I believe that it has become a deportation force, and I think you should separate the criminal justice from the immigration issues, and I think you should reimagine ICE under a new agency with a very different mission and take those two missions out. And so we believe that we should protect families that need our help, and that is not what ICE is doing today, and that's why I believe you should get rid of it, start over, reimagine it, and build something that actually works.
Jim, I remember when Governor David Patterson appointed Kirsten Gillibrand to fill out the term of Hillary Clinton after Hillary became Secretary of State and thinking, wow, he could have done a lot worse. That's not a terrible pick from a Democratic governor. And now you've got Kirsten Gillibrand just about a decade later saying, oh my gosh, ICE deports people.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in this one interview, and I'll kind of lay into Gillibrand in a second here. But I just want to observe the rarity. I mean, mark it, June 29th, 2018. Somebody over at CNN PR should make a note of this and spotlight this. Greg, I'm going to give a little bit of an attaboy to Chris Cuomo, and that's not a position I'm usually in, but he noticed it. It sounded wrong to him. As you said, that expression is like that. It's not quite Tucker Carlson, you're confusing your dog look, the head tilt. But that same sense of like, you sure about that? And then, what I love is he's like, wasn't it 3? And she goes insisting upon, no, you got no votes. And, while like a second ago, she's talking about how you can't trust Trump because he's dishonest. And you shouldn't make glaring factual errors right after you're ripping into somebody else for dishonesty. So it's an amusing scene there. On the whole perspective of her suddenly, by the way, it's worth noting, back when she was in the House, you're right, she was considered a fairly centrist Democrat. She opposed giving driver licenses to illegal immigrants. She was, by and large, considered a restrictionist. Now, look, you go from representing a district to a whole state, you're going to have some changes in your positions. Time goes by, the ground shifts under your feet, the party becomes more liberal. Fine, some of that happens, but there's a certain shamelessness to Kirsten Gillibrand and the way she goes about this. Among them, the fact that, look, we just had a surprise victory in a Democratic primary, and all of a sudden, who's the first one out to wave the flag for abolish ICE? Kirsten Gillibrand! It just dawned on her that this is what ICE does. And we have to get rid of it, and we have to reimagine it, Greg. And I'm just picturing John Lennon playing in the background. Reimagine a new ICE. Because I'd like to say they're deporting people. Yeah, that's kind of what it's a deportation force. Well, when someone's in the country illegally, I hope some debate moderator at some future point puts this question to all of the Democrats this directly. When someone is in the country illegally, what do you want to do about that person? I'm really kind of left with the question, what is that? Because deportation has always been our for a very long time has been our traditional, because otherwise you are effectively open borders. If you don't want to deport people, you may support having a border, checkpoints and all that kind of stuff. But if you say to somebody, American soil is safe base, you can't be tagged out, you can't be thrown back. One, you're only going to encourage enormous new waves of illegal immigration. And you're talking about just a giant fundamental change in our immigration policy. What I've kind of ranted about earlier in the week about, there are some people who believe that to be an American, all you have to do is get here. And that's not what it's been, never been our interpretation of the law. And I think I'd love for Democrats to run on this in 2018 and 2020. Because whether or not they want to admit it's open borders, that is effectively open borders. That is effectively saying we should not have any way of expelling someone who has come into this country illegally, and for obvious reasons. Even if they're the best of folks and the Brooklyn pizza delivery guy or Manuel the busboy, look, maybe they are really good folks, but they've already done one act that demonstrates they're not respecting our laws. So that's the first thing and I think a whole bunch of other Americans would say, we can argue about whether deportation is the right choice for every one of these guys, but there has to be a consequence. And I think a whole bunch of these folks are making very clear that they don't want any consequence. And once you're here, you're safe. We're not going to have anything happen to you. And then the second thing is this general sense of how do you determine Manuel the busboy who's got a good heart and wants to be an American someday and is never going to hurt anybody from the MS-13 member? How do you sort out the person who's got an affiliation with a terror group or something like that? We all know that the San Bernardino terrorists entered the country legally, in part because we didn't check their social media thoroughly enough. So I don't think Democrats really are thinking through this. They just love this narrative of big, mean Trump and his big, mean immigration force and not really thinking through, okay, if you guys don't like ICE, you want to reimagine it, you got to tell us exactly how you envision this happening, because the details matter. And I don't like this idea of it's going to be a kindler and gentler ICE someday, but we'll tell you about it after we're elected.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And if they think they're going to win over the middle, the independents, with that line, I think they got another thing coming. Jim, I know it's common on Twitter when you see a certain story, a lot of people like to say, oh, he's running or she's running. But the fact that she's tacking this far left, I think, suggests that she probably is pretty serious about 2020, assuming she doesn't have any stumbling blocks this year when she runs for re-election.
Yeah, and it's New York. You really wouldn't expect very much.
Right.
I remember Vogue wrote about her about, say, either late last year, early this year. And it was really just this glowing profile. And I kind of was left scratching my head when I read it because I just, first of all, out of the entire crowded Democratic field, I have a hard time seeing Kirsten Gillibrand rocketing to the top. The profile insisted that she was a independent-minded, breaking the partisan gridlock one, which you really, they're just, and I kept reading through the article looking for the non-liberal position, and I couldn't find any. So, I mean, maybe by Vogue standards, she's a centrist, but she really isn't. And then the third thing is that, like I said, I'm not going to say she's dumb, but there's something clumsy about the way that she chases these sorts of things. Like I said, a lot of politicians will evolve on issues or change their positions over time, but there's something kind of, I don't want to say desperate and flailing, but ham-fisted to come out and do cable news and suddenly insist we have to abolish ICE this quickly and this glaringly. It just looks a little shamelessly opportunistic, and I'm not so sure that will resonate with the Democratic presidential primary voters, as she thinks.
She did get rid of Al Franken, though. I think the plot blew up in her face when Roy Moore didn't win, but she did get rid of Al Franken. That's
a good point. Give her nominate her then. Go Democrats. Go with that.
Jim, in another exhausting week. It is Friday, thankfully. Have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you again on Monday.
See you Monday, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Have a great weekend, everyone, and please do join us again on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.